The Roman Republic and the Conquest of the Mediterranean World, 300 BC, 80 BC. Introduction: A Temple in India. Very few maps have survived from the ancient world. There are really only a handful of world maps that we know were produced in the Roman Empire over a period of several centuries. However, one of these, the so-called Tabula Peutingeriana, provides striking evidence of the breadth of Rome's influence across much of the world. On the edges of this map, there is a note that a temple was built in honor of Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, in a place called Muziris. This, by itself, is not unusual. That is until we consider that Muziris is in western India. How, we might ask, did a temple honoring a Roman ruler come to be built here far from Rome's borders? But even more startling to consider is that 300 years before this temple was built, Rome was a small republican state in central Italy that few people had heard of beyond the western Mediterranean. It's a testament to the expansion of the Roman Republic between 300 BC and the 1st century BC that Rome's influence was being felt on the other side of the world by Augustus's time. This is the story of the expansion of the Roman Republic and how it became a global superpower. The Punic Wars. By 300 BC, the Roman Republic was still a relatively modest power, though it had begun to expand from its status as a tiny city-state in 343 BC when it went to war with the Samnites and several other Latin powers of central Italy. From there, it emerged as the dominant force in central Italy by 290 BC, and thereafter engaged in wars against the Greek colonies of southern Italy in 280 and 270 BC. All of this expansion brought Rome into the sphere of influence of Carthage, a Phoenician power based out of North Africa in what is now Tunisia. The Carthaginians were the dominant power of the western Mediterranean, with control over much of Sicily, Sardinia, and the coastal regions of the Iberian Peninsula. Over the next century and a bit, Rome would fight 3 wars against Carthage. These are known as the Punic Wars, after a Roman word for the Carthaginians. Of these, the first 2 were the significant ones. The First Punic War was fought between 264 BC and 241 BC, while the Second Punic War was fought between 218 BC and 201 BC. The first primarily consisted of clashes for control of Sicily and Sardinia. In the course of it, Rome was forced to become a major naval power for the first time. Eventually, it managed to emerge victorious and claim the Italian islands from the Carthaginians. However, Carthage was far from defeated, and in 230 and 220 BC, the Barcids, a prominent noble family in Carthage, prevailed on their people to engage in a strategy of rebuilding Carthage's power in Hispania, the ancient name for the Iberian Peninsula, before then initiating a war of revenge against Rome. This strategy very nearly succeeded. It began in 218 BC when one of the Barcids, the Carthaginian general Hannibal, famously led an army that included elephants from North Africa from Hispania into southern France and then over the Alps into northern Italy. The Romans had not expected a land invasion from the north and were completely unprepared for the attack. Hannibal won several crushing victories in the period that followed, and Rome's allies began to abandon the Republic. Yet Hannibal failed to capture Rome itself, and over the years that followed, it managed to launch counter-invasions of Carthage's territories in Hispania. Eventually, the Romans managed to succeed in conquering all of Carthage's strongholds in Hispania, and then Publius Cornelius Scipio, a Roman general, led a campaign to North Africa, where he defeated Hannibal and his Carthaginians in a climactic battle on the plains of Zama in 202 BC. The following year, with the Romans laying siege to the city of Carthage itself, the Carthaginians negotiated a treaty whereby they ceded all their territory in Hispania to Rome and agreed to limit themselves to being a small trading city in North Africa. Rome was now master of the Western Mediterranean world. A third Punic War followed half a century later between 149 BC and 146 BC. But it was not a contest between equals. Rome captured the city of Carthage, leveled it to the ground, sowed the earth with salt, and sold its remaining people into slavery in what was an early recorded instance of something akin to genocide. Expansion in the East. At the height of the Second Punic War, a number of the Greek powers further to the east were pulled into the war as allies supplying aid to Rome and Carthage. This opened up new vistas for Rome after the war ended, as various entities there began seeking the aid of the Roman military in the constant wars and squabbles between the Greek powers such as the Kingdom of Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, the Achaean and Aeolian Leagues, and the kingdoms of Pontus, Pergamum, and Bithynia. Over the next century, Rome would fight over a dozen major wars in the East, becoming a reluctant power here in the process. At first, the Romans simply tried to extract tribute from various Greek states and not rule the region directly. But from 160 BC onwards, they began acquiring territory on the Greek mainland and the Balkans. By the second half of the 2nd century BC, they had a growing array of territory in the eastern Mediterranean. Eventually, in the 70 and 60 BC, they would defeat their two foremost enemies here, the Kingdom of Pontus and the Seleucid Empire, ushering in a period of hegemony in the eastern Mediterranean. When added to the dominance that had been acquired in the western Mediterranean at the end of the Second Punic War, this put Rome firmly on the path to turning the Mediterranean world into Mare Nostrum, our lake. Roman culture. The Romans might have begun to conquer the eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd century BC, but the Greeks were inadvertently conquering the Romans culturally. Roman culture was not exactly a sophisticated one by the end of the Punic Wars. A number of comedians had begun to produce plays in the city, and there were some writers like Cato the Elder who produced books on subjects like Roman agriculture. All in all, though, its culture was mediocre by comparison with the vibrant Greek culture to the east, with its centuries of philosophy, history, scientific inquiry, and work in various other disciplines. With the expansion into the eastern Mediterranean, the Romans began encountering this Greek culture, and over time it was absorbed by the Romans. Many Romans began learning to speak, read, and write Greek, and before long they were emulating Greek writers. For instance, Virgil's Aeneid, the greatest epic prose work of Roman literature, was very consciously written in emulation of Homer's Iliad, the greatest work of Greek epic prose. Roman historians like Livy were copying the methods of Greek forebears such as Thucydides and Herodotus. Before long, Stoicism, a Greek philosophical system that emerged in Athens around the time of the First Punic War, was on its way to becoming the preeminent philosophical school amongst the Romans. Thus, while the Romans conquered all before them, they also absorbed the culture of the people they conquered. Social problems and the crisis of the Republic. Expansion was also bringing with it problems at home in Rome. The influx of wealth into the city as more and more provinces were conquered led to many equestrian and plebeian families becoming even wealthier than the patrician families of Rome, turning the traditional social order on its head. Furthermore, there were a great many subject people around the Italian peninsula who had been ruled by Rome for centuries by the late 2nd century BC, who wanted to share in the spoils of expansion and to be awarded Roman citizenship, something which was largely reserved for the people of the city itself and older citizen families. All of this led to decades of instability from the 130 BC, culminating in the social war between 91 BC and 87 BC. In this, the Italian allies of Rome went to war with the Roman state in what was effectively a civil war. It only ended when the Senate agreed to extend the privileges of Roman citizenship to all free people living on the Italian peninsula. It would be another 3 centuries before that privilege was extended to all subject people of Rome. Marius versus Sulla. The social war and the crisis it wrought was just one issue confronting the Roman Republic. A far graver one was the rise of overly powerful generals. As Rome expanded year after year after the Punic Wars, Roman political life became more and more about acquiring military commands in the East and then using conquests there as a springboard to wealth and power back home in Rome. By the late 2nd century BC, the Roman generals were the most important figures within the Republic, and some were beginning to trammel on the authority of the Roman Senate. This became an especially difficult situation when one of the most powerful of the generals, Gaius Marius, introduced a series of military reforms in 107 BC, which instituted a professional standing army. Previously, Rome's army had still been made up of citizen soldiers who served seasons as legionaries before returning to civilian life. But the reforms now ushered in a standing army. With full-time professional soldiers behind them as supporters, individual generals now posed a threat to the stability of the Republic. This was made clear in the years that followed, as a rivalry between Marius and a younger upstart by the name of Cornelius Sulla effectively split the Roman Republic into 2 factions of Marians and Sullans. A series of conflicts bubbled along through the 90s and 80s BC between the two before boiling over into outright civil war in 83 BC after Marius had died, and his faction was taken over by his son Marius Junior and another figure, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. In this conflict, Sulla marched on Rome with an army and succeeded in claiming complete control over the Republic in 82 BC. Then he claimed the power of dictatores, a Roman constitutional measure whereby a military commander was granted massive powers to deal with a military emergency. While the Republic survived, Sulla was the virtual dictator of it for the next 3 years, the Senate unable to challenge his power. The old institutions of the Republic were only able to survive because in 79 BC, of his own volition, Sulla elected to relinquish his powers and step down from control of the state. An uneasy future. Sulla had stepped down in 79 BC and retired from his position as dictators. He died just a year later. However, none of the underlying structural problems of the Roman Republic or the social and political tensions which had allowed for his rise to power had been fixed. Conversely, there were many young Romans from eminent families in the 70s and 60s BC who looked at what Sulla had done and saw a blueprint for rising to unprecedented power. Amongst them was a man by the name of Gaius Julius Caesar, a scion of the gens Julii, a prominent family. Caesar was a former supporter of Cinna and Marius Junior, and had only barely survived the purge of his enemies that Sulla had engaged in after he won the civil war. He, more than any other individual, would seek to emulate Sulla in the years ahead, and unlike Sulla, Caesar had no intention of relinquishing the power of dictators when he acquired them. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit the like button. For more content like this, subscribe to the channel. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. For now, we bid you adieu. See you in the next one.